Hello and welcome to the Pask Gradcast, a podcast by grad students for grad students from the Office of Graduate Studies in the Harry W. Bass School of Arts, Humanities, and Technology at the University of Texas at Dallas. I'm your host, Rachel Catlett, a humanities PhD student and research assistant in the Bass School. Here at the Pask Gradcast, we invite on Bass School graduate students to discuss their research, their journey, and their academic passions. Joining me today is Merve Sahin, a PhD candidate and EODIA fellow in the Visual and Performing Arts program at the University of Texas at Dallas. She earned her Master's of Arts degree from the San Francisco Art Institute as a Fulbright Scholar, where her thesis research was included in Leonardo Abstract Services, or LABS, and invited to the Media, Arts, and Design Conference in 2020. Before embarking on her PhD program, she taught art history and visual communication design classes at Sabancı University and Yeditepe University in Istanbul, Turkey. Merve's research on art and technology focuses on conceptual and historical analysis. Welcome, Merve.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you for having me.
We're so glad you're here today. So can you please just start by talking a little bit about your research, which primarily focuses on cybernetics from sort of an art history perspective, and just talk a little bit about the foundation of your research and how that's manifesting in your dissertation.
So I think the best way to start to this question would be how to include art and technology in the canon of art history. Because so far, when we think of art history, we come across the classical studies like ancient Greeks and Roman. You have Renaissance, Baroque, and what you have in later abstraction and impressionist and whatnot. So one of the main questions here is, where do you situate art and technology here? Because now you have you don't have the classical medium, but you have the circuits instead of painting, instead of a canvas, and now you have, as I was telling you about before, EEG data being included in our conception of what constitutes art. So I think one of the most interesting part that my dissertation is doing is that it investigates this history, and specifically the history of cybernetics and how it could be relevant to art history. One of the interesting questions that I am asking in my dissertation is the scale, is the problem of scale. Not the problem, but how we can approach to the problem of scale from different perspectives. Because when you look into cybernetics, what you have is a study of cells, you have the study of robots, but at the same time, in the later developments, you have a conception of geobiological turn in cybernetics. So you have the new addition of geology into the problem. And as you can see, there's different scales of cell to the land pieces that my dissertation is interested in.
That's so fascinating. And I definitely want to talk a little bit more about land art and sort of that aspect. But before we do, can you just sort of briefly talk about what cybernetics means in terms of the parameters of your project for people who maybe aren't as familiar?
Yeah, this is one of the common questions that I receive is, what is cybernetics? And I try to approach it in two different ways. One of them is a conceptual. What does conceptually cybernetics means? And the other thing is how it emerged historically. What is the context that it came about? To start with, the conceptual background is that there is this paper written by the physicist Maxwell that some of you may know, and he described the concept of cybernetics, as a steerman or governor. So think about it this way, that you have a ship and your ship is going into left, but you want it to go to right. So you steer the wheel and then it goes to the other direction. In a way, you give feedback to a system. You have an input, an output, and then you have a negative feedback that feeds into system so that you have an adaptive system. Another way to think about this is the control and communication that's being described by Norbert Wiener. And in this way, the negative feedback and how the circular feedback, I think also a good way of describing it is constitute what is cybernetics. In terms of its historical background, it came it came during 1940s during Macy conferences, and the primary objective of these conferences was to unify sciences, unify social sciences with positive sciences such as anthropology, physics, mathematics, engineering, into to create a cross-cultural, cross dialogue in between disciplines. And later, the Macy conferences titled as Cybernetics conferences because the participants that were playing a major role in these conferences came up with this notion that it should be called cybernetics. And in this space, cybernetics is what I call is a meta field, and it's highly conceptual. It brought a lot of new concepts into our vocabulary that influenced many other fields.
In what way? I mean, cybernetics seems like it feels very buzzwordy today, right?
Yeah.
Like it seems very relevant to a lot of the conversations we're having in the humanities today, and in other fields, as you've pointed out. It is a very sort of interdisciplinary concern. So in what way are we seeing these concerns with cybernetics being relevant today, and in what way is that tied into specifically your dissertation research?
So I think the most conventional way that the cybernetics is relevant today is artificial intelligence, because the notion of input, output, and you have a feedback is the governing concept in software design. And what you have is neural networks in artificial intelligence, and it's a concept that emerged from cybernetics, although neural networks is kind of an old news now in the in the research of AI. And what happened to cybernetics is it emerged in the 1940s, but then you have a second turn in cybernetics. And then it was very popular until the 1970s, and it seemed to be a dying field afterwards. My research actually goes beyond that. It goes beyond to 1990s, where the Gaian theory came about. And Gaian theory deals with how our Earth is this stabilizing effect with its atmosphere, which was a new idea at the time. And James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis came up with this theory, and it defines geological turn in cybernetics. And in that regard, I think it's very relevant today in the sense that it questions to the artificial life we have today, but at the same time, it questions the notion of ecology in today's world. And I mentioned about the second turn in cybernetics, and I think like it's an important thing to give our audience a little bit of what was the second turn was about. So the first turn, the first order cybernetics was this idea of having an input-output feedback, and this feedback was really taught as a black box that we don't know what it is. But then second order cybernetics try to see the role of the observer into this equation.
You mentioned earlier this sort of question of scale, or you've already previewed these questions of scale and ecology. And I know from seeing your talk in the graduate student speaker series that this sort of fascinating land art and these enormous art pieces that sort of combine or like are thinking through this ecological issue of cybernetics are something that you're interested in. Can you speak a little bit about those?
Yeah. So in general, what we referred as land art is the artworks that are not in the confines of a gallery space. And you can really think about a lot of things. Like you can think about performance art, but it's not really land art. It's rather the land art pieces usually deal with the nature, the landscape itself. And you have many artists who goes outside in the mostly in the United States. I mean, there are some examples in Europe as well. Goes out in the nature and build this enormous pieces like Robert Smithson, Michael Heiser. He recently had one in Utah. It's like this giant scale. But the artist that I am interested in is rather approach to land art pieces through a lens of system aesthetics, or what I call is in a way how the nature has, or how the installations could perform a systematic approach, ecological concern into the equation. And we will, I guess, talk about in detail. This artist that I'm working on is Agnes Denes, and she, for example, one of the pieces she did was in Finland, and she recruited 11,000 people to plant trees into a little mountainscape, and in a way that it's kind of creates this a circular mountainscapes.
Yeah, it was like a spiral. And
Yeah,
it was really
kind of-
breathtaking.
Yeah,
And like you said, it's so funny that you mentioned sort of classical theorists, because I think there is almost a classical connection here because of so much of ancient Greek art's interest in like mathematics, right? And how this like combination of nature and nature and systems, I think, is really interesting, and in a way sort of obscurely connects to classical art in that way.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways that her artworks also got into that in terms of the dialectical thinking, and interestingly, they were also exhibited in exhibitions like of art and technology as well. Like she does this dialectical triangulation in terms of how the food pyramid is built upon, and in a lot, I think like it really questions beyond the nature, beyond like more of logic and cognition as well.
I know there are two other artists in your study besides Denes that you're looking at, Gordon Pask and Nina Sobell. Do you want to speak at all on sort of their work as well and how that ties into your research?
Yeah. So my second chapter is going to be on Gordon Pask, and I was recently in his archive in Vienna.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it was really cool, and I was able to really dig into his work. So Gordon Pask is a cybernetician. It's really hard to locate him in between the first order and second order cybernetics, because he's one of these people who really preceded the second order cybernetics, like came up with the concepts that influenced the later conception. And he does these very interesting robots, and not really robots, but machines, I think is a better way to put it, that is adaptive environment. So it interacts with the people, or really to machine interaction as well. One of the pieces that I was telling you about was Musicolor, where he designed this machine that could have a light show, the very first light shows we have, and in a way that it will give a note, and through feedback it interacts with the singer, and at some point it gets bored, and then it tries to do new things. Or one of his earlier examples is this electrochemical ear that he developed that can perform hearing, which is very interesting. And I'm looking into the machines that he have built it during like his lifetime, his early works until the late works that he did. In terms of Nina Sobell, she is one of the things I'm very interested in women artists, like how, like kind of to dig into to the history of women artists. And that's why like I chose Nina Sobell and Agnes Denes, because I think it's very important for us to really have a history of women artists. And in terms of Nina Sobell, she started as a sculptor, and she does this interactive sculptures that you can go into while she was in Cornell. And then she was interested in EEG art, and what she did was she hooked up two people into a machine, and then they see the EEG data on the screen and how through the EEG data they can communicate with each other without a verbal cue, which was very interesting because in a way it questions like what constitutes communication in cybernetics in a way that hasn't been taught about before. These artists are really, they haven't been really, I mean, except Gordon Pask, he's a cybernetician and he's very like well studied in the context of cybernetics. But when it comes to Nina Sobell and Agnes Denes, my work is relatively novel in the sense that they have not been studied in the context of cybernetics and how certain concepts in cybernetics that emerged relate to these artworks in a fundamental way.
Do you feel like, you mentioned that you studied physics as part of your undergraduate degree. Do you feel like this past in sort of the hard sciences has sort of brought you to this stage you're at where you're looking to combine art and science in this very like tangible way?
Absolutely. I mean, so I started in the physics department in my undergrad, and I was working at the laser research lab. And I was thinking of double majoring in philosophy and physics, which is, I think, a lot of cyberneticians have like some experience in both fields. And it took me so long to find this research subject that actually brings together a lot of my background. And it took me at least 6 years to find my PhD advisor who can like study with me these concepts and guide me through the PhD program. And it really takes a lot for me to understand these concepts. And I think like if I didn't study physics or hard sciences before, understanding these difficult machines or like the codes and whatnot would have been very difficult. So I'm very lucky that I had some background in there.
I love that you mentioned your journey or how long it took you to find the right PhD advisor, because you're with Dr. Terranova, right? Yeah, who's wonderful. I know that's certainly something that I didn't necessarily think about prior to entering grad school, and I got extremely lucky in having met somebody who really understood and nurtured, my interests. But can you maybe talk a little bit about that part of your journey and why it's so critical? I mean, especially in a field like yours that is so complex and where you're doing, as you mentioned, some kind of novel things. Sort of talk a little bit about that importance for, graduate students who aren't as far in their path as you are.
Yeah, I mean, it was very painful experience, honestly, because So in my undergrad, I studied like a little physics, philosophy, and visual arts. So I didn't have a concrete background in art history. And then in my undergrad, I applied to PhD programs in art history with my, funny ideas, I would say. And it's really rare to find an advisor who can guide me through art and technology because it's really a new field. I think like you have 2 generations of scholars previous to me,
which is quite new.
Yeah, it's very new. And like, of course, I got all rejections, and I still sometimes receive emails of rejections. They try to send it to me every year, I guess.
You're like, just in case you didn't remember.
Just in case you didn't realize. So it's very difficult to find faculty members who are interested in this field and like well versed in these ideas, because at some point when you get into the PhD program, you speak your own language. Like the next person who studies next to you have no idea what you're doing, and you have no idea what they are doing. You have like a little bit of ideas, but like not really deeper sense. And I got rejected, so I applied to SFAI, San Francisco Art Institute, to do an art history study. And I got in, which was great. And then once I graduated, it took me another round of PhD applications that, again, resulted in rejections. And my master thesis chair was friends with Dr. Terranova. So she put me in touch with her because she was hiring a PhD student in the program. And the moment we start speaking, we were like connecting so well. We were like understanding each other. Up until that point, I thought like I was just this like dislocated. I was like, I tried to like do something. I think art history should have this vision to go forward in terms of art and technology, because if you think about it, okay, you have these classical studies that were in art history, but at the same time, you have a new wave that the artists are doing since 1950s and 40s. How to integrate them into the field, because the field needs this. Like, if you think about art history, the future of art history needs to have some art and technology background, and we need scholars who are digging deeper into these conversations. And I was so lucky to find Dr. Ternova. She offered me the position, and I ended up being here.
I think your story is such a great reminder. It's to get personal, it's very similar to mine in a lot of ways, in that like my path has meandered and I've sort of either gotten opportunities or lost opportunities, and at the time not been able, but I've very much learned to just sort of that my journey will take me where I need to be, and I'll meet the people that I need to meet. And that's not to say that I'm not ambitious or being active in that, but I think it's a good reminder that rejections are not always rejections. Sometimes they're opportunities.
Yeah, they really lead you to the right place. And I guess like if you do rather like conventional like orthodox studies, it's easy to find your place. It's easy to find your scholars. But I think if you do interdisciplinary research that involves like different fields, then it's very difficult to navigate within. I remember that there was a 50-year celebration of the journal Leonardo that Rich Molina here is leading the publication house. And they came to my school for the celebration, and I felt like home. Like I felt like, oh, I found my people. Oh, yeah, and it took me a long time to like find the people that are interested in what I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What advice do you have for, maybe master's students who are starting to contemplate finding a good PhD program, or just for finding, the right place as a scholar? Obviously, you were lucky in that you were connected to Dr. Ternova, and therefore this program through a connection. But what advice do you have, I guess, for people starting to consider that next step?
I think like one advice is don't waste your application money to programs that may not be well suited for you. And I think the best way to approach to a PhD program is to find an advisor who is going to speak the same language as you do. And that is going to take a lot of time. Like it sometimes I was very lucky that my master thesis chair, Merve Sahin, who's also in my committee now too, put me in touch. And that is part of the journey, that you have a little bit of networking to do. And I guess the best way to approach to this would be really reading the books, like finding your people, like finding the journals that you think like fit well into what you are planning on doing research on. And so, and I was so lucky to find Dr. Ternova. She is more than an advisor for me. She's a friend as well, who is not like thinking of me as someone who she needs to manage and like guide, but as someone who is going to have a whole journey ahead of me, not just in terms of my academic success, but at the same time my well-being.
If someone's interested in learning more about cybernetics, but especially about, this confluence of cybernetics and art, where would you recommend they start looking in terms of reading, watching, artists to look at, things like that?
Yeah, I think which is one of the problems that I am tackling in my dissertation, is the concept of how the concept in cybernetics relate to art. I want to say aesthetics, but when we think of aesthetics, it's very a concept of beauty. And I think I'm more interested in the material culture of it. So I think the best way to start in understanding cybernetics is the concepts in cybernetics and how they emerged because in a way they are really like build it on top of each other, like a palimpsest. And like you have negative feedback, homeostasis, autopoiesis, and they are really like tracing each other. So I would say to start cybernetics is to understand the concepts that emerged in cybernetics and how they related to the other fields. One of the books that I really like is by Heinz von Foster, Cybernetics of Cybernetics.
What a great title.
Yeah. So in that regard, like the second order cybernetics emerged as a critique of the first order. So in like a little bit recursivity there. That book was fantastic because it's really think cybernetics through the concepts, and it's like, okay, you have negative feedback and you have the paper that defined negative feedback and was influential in the conferences, and it goes on and on. It's a thick book. The interlibrary loan brought it to me. And in terms of the art and cybernetics and system thinking, I would suggest Jack Burnham, who was an art historian that like he wrote mainly in the 60s and 70s in terms of the system thinking into the artist practices. And he also think about like kinetic art, land art practices through the lens of cybernetics, which is like one of the fundamental things that I go back a lot in my dissertation, like tie the objects into the concepts. Other than that, yeah, like these two people would be great places to start.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. It was so lovely.
Yeah, thank you.
The Pask Gradcast is a production of the Office of Graduate Studies in the Pask School of Arts, Humanities, and Technology at the University of Texas at Dallas. Our cover image was designed by Rachel Catlett. Our theme music is Rainbow Party by Greg Shows.